You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and if you have stumbled upon us without coming to either of our websites, you can find us online at teachthought.com, which is our main blog site, and our TeachThought Professional Development website, which is wegrowteachers.com. I'm happy to announce that early bird registration for TeachThought Grow 19 is indeed open and will remain open until April 2nd. We're excited to offer this year a pre-conference day in partnership with the folks at the National School Reform Faculty. If you're not familiar with them, you should be. They do some really great work. I had Michelle Mattoon, who is the director of the National School Reform Faculty, on the podcast episode 130, in which we talked about improving teaching and learning through protocols. So we're going to spend that day really diving into rich inquiry through protocols, trying to learn structures to help students engage in difficult but important conversations. So really the takeaway there will be to learn some structures to use in your classrooms and in your schools to have some of those really difficult conversations in ways that help build skills and critical thinking processes with your students. Of course, our July 17th through 19th will be focused on our popular Foundations of Project-Based Learning workshop, in which you'll learn project-based learning by developing a project for implementation in your classroom. If you're a leader, you'll be developing a project that will be in play for your school. We love having educators from K-12. We've had pre-K, we've had university, we've had folks from as close as Louisville and as far away as Vietnam. So you can go to wegrowteachers.com/grow19 to register and find out more information and details. The space is limited to 70 seats. Jump on over there and take advantage of early bird pricing, which is available till April 2nd. As always, I encourage you to leave reviews and share the podcast with friends and folks in your social media networks and other places. It always helps us to spread the word, to get better guests, and to increase our audience and help thinkers and educators around the world. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Colin Seale, who's the founder and CEO of ThinkLaw. They're an organization that works with educators around building critical thinking skills through some legal cases and I think fairy tales at the younger ages. Interesting conversation and aligns with lots of the work that we do as we try to think about Socratic Method and questions and pull teaching. So we kind of started our conversation talking about those kinds of things, talking about his career as a student underachieving and why that was the case. Went into how we might leverage the critical thinking that students are doing that might be unrecognized, some of the strokes of luck that helped him to be successful, and went to talk about some of the social justice and equity pieces and meritocracy, especially as a blog piece that he has published, and talked about some examples of schools from the Bronx High School of Science and a school in California, charter school, where they do a whole child inventory that I thought was an interesting thing to talk about, and then ended our conversation talking specifically about the workshops that they do with teachers. So, interesting conversation, and I hope you find it helpful. Colin, welcome to the podcast. Let's give our listeners a little bit of background on who you are and kind of the summary of the work you're doing with ThinkLaw as the founder/CEO.
Excited to join you here today, Drew. Thank you so much for having me. I'm the founder of ThinkLaw, and I always think back to describing myself as a educator first. Even being an accidental educator, somebody that was a computer science graduate. I didn't really have education in mind. But when I got to the point and I realized that so many of the opportunities that I got in life as somebody that was coming up in a low-income background really came through the transformational experiences that came through my education, I knew that that was the place that I needed to spend my life's work. And I started ThinkLaw, which helps educators teach critical thinking using legal cases in upper grades, fairy tales and nursery rhymes in lower grades, and a lot of training around Socratic style strategies for all teachers in all grade levels. Because when I was practicing law and going to law school, I realized there's so much power in this thinking like a lawyer model. There's so much intrigue that happens when you ground less instruction in a sense of justice and fairness. There's such a powerful analytical framework. There's this will, this tapping into intrinsic motivation that occurs. And it just struck me as someone that underachieved for most of my academic career, why wait until law school to give kids this sort of opportunity? So that's the work we're doing right now, really trying to tap into those things that intrinsically motivate our kids to make them unleash what I believe is their inherent critical thinking potential.
Interesting. So I don't think it's probably somewhere on the internet. Everything's on the internet. It's permanent, right? But years ago, I had written a blog piece many years ago that was basically in this sort of dynamic of why teachers should think like a lawyer in many cases. And I agree with you so much as far as the questioning and really being able to facilitate and pull really great thinking, which of course is the Socratic Method. And that's a really powerful dynamic that I think is misused or not used enough in our schools for sure. You said you underachieved in academics, so your academic career K-12, or where was that, and why do you think that was?
So it was K-12. It was in undergraduate school. It was in graduate school. I've always been the kind of student that if I cared, I cared, and if I didn't care, I truly didn't care. So what that meant was, especially in a context where a lot of people who become educators because they love the experience of being a student, right? Like they follow the rules. They essentially, like, they did their homework. They didn't really get in trouble.
Right.
And for me, I remember being in school and feeling like, this is kind of a waste of time. I don't think I'm going to do this assignment. And Drew, it was so interesting. I would actually help other students with homework assignments that I wouldn't even do myself. Because if I wasn't invested in it, I just didn't really feel that thrill. It just didn't really do it for me. And that meant that, like, I was always somebody that was in the B and C range. When I first started high school, I was actually in the D and F range for a lot of classes because I just stopped going to a lot of classes where I felt like the work wasn't really compelling enough. But when I think about what it takes to reach kids, and going back to this idea of like thinking like a lawyer, it struck me that when you're thinking like a lawyer, and a middle school principal we're partnering with in New York City actually was the first person to tell me this. She's like, look, I struggled as a writing student when I got to college. I couldn't write any papers. I just really struggled until my professor explained to me, like, you need to write like a lawyer. And she ended up becoming an English major and getting her master's in English because of how much she fell in love with writing. Because this idea of making a claim and backing it up with evidence and considering multiple perspectives and weighing the consequences and drawing a conclusion from that analysis, that's precisely what, like, writing like a lawyer did for her. When you think about, like, that research bug of, like, being able to ask questions until you get the information that you need, it's the same exact way that lawyers conduct investigations and do discovery. And even when I think about, like, my life as a practicing attorney, where honestly, Drew, I'm kind of bashful to say it, but, like, I know more about the physical anatomy of 80-something-year-old woman than any person my age should possibly know. Because I had to do all these pelvic mesh cases as a defense attorney for one of the largest manufacturers of these products, where you had these massive lawsuits. And whether it was pelvic mesh, whether it was casino gaming software, whether it was being able to spot counterfeits for our retail clients, I had to become a subject matter expert at learning how to become a subject matter expert. And if you take that famous Alvin Toffler quote about the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, it'll be those that cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Again, this thinking like a lawyer framework becomes so powerful because all I do all the time is train myself to the space where I'm able to interact with the most proficient, prolific subject matter experts in these different areas as a result of being able to learn how to learn. So I think there's a lot of very positive potential for this model when you think about the 21st century framework we're preparing our kids for, where we literally don't know what kind of fields and work we're preparing them for.
Yeah, some of the dynamics that you're mentioning are things that podcast listeners will certainly be familiar with me talking about, and that idea of pull teaching, which, as you're talking about the discovery process that an attorney goes through, it's really thinking about what do I need to know and learn about and think about in order to present this case and defend or prosecute whichever role you're in. And that piece of being a subject matter expert, and I might use the expertise as opposed to expert, because you certainly don't know everything, but you certainly get a lot of knowledge. And so that's a piece that I think is a really important distinction that we should be making in our classrooms and our schools, is that the idea that we're producing content area experts as students is, I think, a little utopian and unrealistic. The idea that we are helping students become thinkers like content area experts or subject area experts is certainly more realistic, and I think more what you're talking about, right? So how do I think like I'm not sure what the right term or title might be of somebody who knows the pelvic area of an 80-year-old or whatever the case may be, but it's that idea that you're really uncovering and figuring out how those people who do that kind of work think. And to do that, you need to know a lot of content and subject matter. So the idea, and one of the criticisms around that pull teaching, inquiry-based teaching, constructivist teaching, project-based learning that we really do a lot of work on, is that knowledge is not really something that is a strong feature of that. And I vehemently push back. It certainly has to be and should be. A good attorney can't do that kind of work without knowing a lot about that content area.
You're spot on, Drew. You're spot on. And when I start thinking about this idea of like breaking this piece down, where the difference between, the mastery levels that you might need to be able to grasp to get there, what I'm constantly trying to draw teachers into is really understanding the differences and the nuances between critical thinking skills and the critical thinking dispositions that our kids need. So a lot of times teachers are like, oh yeah, our kids need these critical thinking skills. They need to be able to analyze and be able to reason and be able to think outside of the box. And I constantly push back. I'm like, all right, like I'm with you on these skills, but the challenge is a lot of kids have these critical thinking skills already. In fact, in a lot of the schools where we prioritize our Title I high poverty schools, you've got kids that are using critical thinking skills every day just for mere survival. I often think about my mom as like the original prototype of the critical thinker that I grew up with. We're in a single parent home. My father was incarcerated for selling drugs. We didn't have a lot of money, but I saw her constantly optimizing constraints. I saw her constantly being able to like assess people's credibility, to think on her toes. And I saw all these different critical thinking skills playing out every single day. The challenge is we also need those critical thinking habits and mindsets, or those dispositions. Like, how likely is it going to be like the second nature that I'm going to be applying these critical thinking skills throughout my life, throughout my academics, throughout my career? That difference between knowing better and doing better is often how we can look at the difference between just having critical thinking skills and having those dispositions to go with it. And again, I think this is a place where, as teachers, by taking one thinking like a lawyer method, let's say investigation and discovery, and I'll give you an actual content example. I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with, Robert Frost, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. One of my favorite poems ever. And I often see that students sometimes struggle to make connections to poems. But what if instead of just teaching the poem the way we typically do, going through it stanza by stanza, line by line, we actually started with the end of the poem? But I've got promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. And we started the poem right there. We started the analysis right there. Who is this person? Where are they at this point of their journey? And what is causing them to say the things that they're saying? And automatically, our kids start thinking, I got promises to keep, miles to go before I sleep, miles to go before I sleep. This guy clearly has been through some stuff, but he has a long way to go. He's got people that are depending on him, so he's got to keep on pushing. And all of a sudden, a lot of our kids that understand the language of struggle, the experience of struggle, they're starting to see this. They're starting to make these connections. They're starting to see something that's super abstract and make much more concrete relationships with the material. So when we start opening up the poem now, whose woods these are, I think I know. This idea of being in a place where you have to figure out where you are, figure out who owns this, because it's not yours, being an outsider. And again, we're able to bring in all this rich personal relationships with the material that wouldn't normally exist if we just read it just as is. So one of the things I really try to push is thinking like a lawyer is a framework for really starting to hit on those dispositions, to really push that intrinsic motivation to get our kids thinking a little bit more deeply about the content that they're presented with.
So you mentioned your mother, and that's, I think, a good lead in to one of your recent blog pieces and some deeper dives into some of your work and the idea of meritocracy, and as a person of color and having some of those obstacles that you mentioned, which are pretty significant obstacles. I guess tell us a little bit more about how you think about meritocracy and how you think. I find it really very interesting to look at individual cases and folks who have, everybody has obstacles. Some of us have less of them than others. What kinds of things do you think enabled you to transcend some of those obstacles that seem to keep other people down?
So I'm going to be honest with you, Drew. One of the toughest parts about telling my story is I'm always a little bit worried, Drew, that people are going to hear it and be like, okay, that's what I'm talking about. Pull yourself up from the bootstraps. And if he could do it, anybody could do it. Mm-hmm. And what goes missing in this story is the tremendous amount of good fortune, chance, opportunity, pure luck that plays into the story of making somebody like me actually unleash their full potential. But for these really stroke of luck experiences, I could very easily be another story of the genius that we leave on the table. I think back to being in first grade and getting in trouble on a regular basis. And if you were a black boy in the late 80s getting in trouble in Brooklyn for your behavior, you're typically not going to get the opportunity to be put in a gifted and talented program. It turns out that because of my behavior, because I had a speech impediment, they made me do this battery of different tests. And through those tests, which were probably intended to try to find what special education program I was going to be in, it was discovered that I should have been in the gifted program since I was in kindergarten. And I ended up being one of 12 students being bused to this school per grade level in Brooklyn, New York. to have access to this amazing transformational learning experience. And that's when it first hit me, looking back at these pictures of me being in this class of an elementary school with 30 plus kids per class, and we only have 24, and it's like a second/third grade, 12 kids per grade. And that's when that idea that genius, which we know has to be distributed equally, but the opportunity simply is not. And when I look at that injustice, and I look at like the fact that even within my class, Drew, even within those 24 kids that were identified gifted in this Brooklyn school, 3 didn't even graduate from high school. And you're like, well, why is that even possible? How could these kids with unlimited potential not even finish high school? I was almost a fourth. I had 80 absences my freshman year in high school. And when I start thinking about like the way in which certain really caring adults came in my life to love on me, to essentially demand that I didn't throw away my potential, I got really lucky. I got really lucky when I got to college and I was student body president, but I was put through the ringer at Syracuse University through a string of different controversial events. And I essentially stopped going to a lot of my classes. I dropped some classes. I fell below the minimum number of credit requirements. And a woman in the administration essentially fought for me to be able to keep my funding so that I can continue to go to the school. I didn't even know that she was doing that for me, but she stuck her neck out at a time where kids like me would have just kind of been pushed out or been forced out because they wouldn't have been able to afford it anymore. I had so many interventions in my life, Drew, that I really did not have control over. People really did look out for me in ways that are not something that's predictable. It's not something that's systemic. And part of what I want to try to do, part of the work that I'm trying to lead with ThinkLaw by giving every kid access to this kind of critical thinking that's going to give them that spark is I'm kind of sick of stories like mine being an exception to the rule. I truly want to create a universe where kids with stories like mine achieving, excelling, reaching their full potential is normal. Every kid should have a fair shot at being exceptional. And that's sometimes, like I said, the challenge of telling my story in the way that people receive it.
Yeah, it strikes me as there's a common denominator in the stories that I hear and the questions that I ask with folks who often and too often are people of color that are stories like the one that you've told. And the common denominator seems to success seems to be at least one adult or mentor of some kind. I have a really good friend who is, he grew up in the west end of Louisville, which, if you know, Louisville is the primarily African-American, and lots of the low socioeconomic status indicators and obstacles that you might imagine that go with that. And I asked him, I said, what helped you transcend that? And he said he was eventually had a career in the hospitality hotel industry. He said there was a chef that took interest in me and basically said, I'm going to help you. And that was somebody who really made a difference in his life. And that story is not unusual for those folks like yourself who do transcend some of those obstacles. And so I guess it's really interesting to think about how do we systemically build in more of those opportunities, because we can talk about white privilege and we can talk about some of those social justice things, and the idea, I think, is you put it in an interesting way, sort of the strokes of luck that helped you. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that low socioeconomic status, minorities, whatever labels we want to put out there, need most often need more strokes of luck in their lives to be successful, and that's just relying on chance, right? And there's always going to be an element of chance. So when we think about social justice and equity work, and that's something that we're wrestling with here in the work that we do, how do we do that in a way that I guess shifts that's those systems and does it in a way that's empowering and not, I guess, whatever the opposite of disempowering is.
Yeah. So Drew, that's a great question. In the piece that I wrote, Aunt Becky and Teaching the Truth About Meritocracy, I speak to some of these issues. If we want to create more opportunities where stories like mine are not a compilation of random acts of chance, we need to be really intentional and really focused about what are the structures that already exist within low socioeconomic communities that actually are power centers. When I think about my family, for instance, my family is all from Barbados. And I remember they called it a meeting. Some people call it a susu. But I remember at a time when they didn't really have access to a traditional banking system and traditional savings and lines of credit or anything to that sort. I remember my mother and my grandmother used to go half on submitting, I think, $50 a week into this pot. And the ladies at the church would essentially manage this process where once every week, one of these 20 or 30 women would get the money that was in this pot. And you got to understand, Drew, before this time, you can't buy furniture without having this cash infusion. If you have a relative that dies and you have to have a funeral, there's no funeral without this cash infusion. So this meeting, this network of people that came together to kind of support each other and look out for each other. And when I think about the potential for what that example represents in our communities, I'm thinking to myself, there is an opportunity to talk about networking from a much earlier age. A lot of kids don't learn about networking until they get into college, presuming that they're doing some sort of major in the business or marketing space. But if we started talking about the power of building networks a lot earlier, and we start thinking about tapping into even young adult or young adult networks. So when I was a middle school teacher, I would always get my middle school graduates who were already in high school to come back and talk to my kids. And they would know that when they got to this high school, they now had a friend. They now had someone to look out for them. And this idea that they're not alone, that they can kind of build off of each other, that they can be part of this wall of support. And as a professional person of color, one of the things that you frequently see, Drew, is you see people that say, you know what, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to put my head down, I'm going to get to work, and I'm going to get this work done. The challenge is, like I say in that piece that I wrote, if you are the kind of person that needs to rely on merit for your success, it is very likely that that merit by itself is not going to be enough. And we need to be honest. We need to be truly honest about that fact. It can't be just merit. You need to add more to that. You need to be able to broaden your opportunity base by pushing yourself to get out there.
So that term honest, I think, is a really important one. And let's pull on that thread a little bit, because one of the things that I really do believe in is being honest and forthright in these difficult conversations, right? Which is not easy to do, and something that we are having a hard time doing as a society. But one of the dynamics that comes into play around social justice and equity and diversity and some of these issues that we're discussing here is the ability to have honest conversations and to be able to say some things that may or may not be viewed or felt as offensive in the interest of advancing the conversation. So that's one of the things that I think is holding the social justice equity movement back. I don't know what you feel is what do you think the social justice equity kinds of movements are getting right, and what do you think they're getting wrong?
I think that in the education space in particular, one of the biggest challenges that I have about it is we are sometimes blinding ourselves to really important pieces of the conversation. So we, for instance, might do a lot of training and awareness raising around trauma in education. And we might talk about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and understanding that like there's all this stuff that kids are bringing into the classroom that, you know, leads to X, Y, and Z. And I get it. I have a really high ACEs score based off of my history. But one of the things that is an unfortunate consequence of sometimes having that lens, where on one hand, yes, it's helpful to be empathetic, but on the other hand, we're missing out on something really important, Drew. I think we're missing out on the fact that like a lot of what is going to make our kids awesome isn't going to be despite. It's going to be because. It's not that they've prevailed despite this happening to them and going through this experience. It's because they prevailed because of that. It's because these things have made them stronger, because these things have made them more persistent, more resilient, more hungry, more determined. And I think that sometimes we are missing the magic. We are simply not able to see the magic that our kids are bringing to the table because we've, in the realm of trying to make people have a more collective, realistic understanding of what we're dealing with, we've lowered our ability to see the amazingness that our kids are bringing to the table each and every day.
So not operating from a deficit perspective. So the statement, and I steal this a little bit, I think it was first coined, or at least I credit it to John Merrow, who I've done a couple podcasts with. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but the idea that we, instead of asking how smart are these kids, asking how are these kids smart, and building upon those strengths, knowing that there are certain content pieces and skills that we, I think, can all recognize. Reading and writing and numeracy, math, basic math skills are important, right? Financial literacy, those kinds of things. But that there are geniuses and strengths that people have, potentials that people have that don't always and often don't fit into the narrow metrics and boxes that education uses to signify success for individuals, classes, schools, school districts, or the system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, we're not a system by and large that is designed to capture the outlier. We're just not. And I see this all the time, Drew, where teachers would tell you, yeah, without a doubt, the top 5 behavior challenge students in our school are probably 5 of the most brilliant kids in my school at the same time. And it's been a really tough thing. Like, it doesn't matter whether we're working with a rural school, a school in an urban area, suburban area. It's such a common trend that it leads me to believe, like, yeah, we just have a tough time recognizing and fostering the brilliance of kids that are exhibiting it in ways that are not really consistent with the norm.
It's interesting as I think about that. So my K-12 experience was similar in many ways to the one that you described for yourself. I really did not do particularly well, especially in high school. I was certainly fine in elementary, a little bit less fine in middle school, but just really decided, hey, I'm just not going to do this because it doesn't seem compelling or interesting. Now, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, let's say 16-year-old kids are not necessarily the best judge of what's best for them, but there is certainly at play in this conversation the way that teaching and learning has been done to kids, not with and for kids. And so what I think about is that I sort of tuned out, and I don't know what your behavior problems or issues might have been, if at all, but I didn't have a lot of behavior issues in school. Like, I wasn't constantly written up, I wasn't getting in fights and that kind of thing. I did have some disagreements with teachers and things like that, but it didn't feel like school was recognizing my strengths and building upon those strengths. It was asking me to do things for the school and the adults that I didn't feel was very relevant to me. But at home, I guess I'd had enough structure, and the expectations from my parents was that at least while you might be outspoken and question some of the things that they're asking you to comply with, that you certainly don't act foolish, silly, get yourself in trouble a lot. But, and maybe that's a distinction from students that you might be describing who are really have lots of real potential and strength and struggling to fit inside that system, but then don't have that home structure and expectations that help them at least kind of get through it without causing themselves more problems long term because of behavior issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say, Drew, I was a 16-year-old that really didn't know everything in the world. So I don't know what you're talking about. But I had it all figured out.
I think you were in my classes as a teacher.
So I can actually go back to this, and if I'm thinking back in my high school career, I was similar, and I didn't really have behavior issues by the time I was in high school. It was more of like I was a checked out kid. Mm-hmm. But part of the reason why I was a checked out kid, and mind you, I was going to the Bronx High School of Science, which, we've been in the news recently because there are only, I think, 7 kids accepted to Stuyvesant that were African American and 12 that were accepted to the Bronx High School of Science that are African American. And there's this whole thing as to whether or not this one test should be deciding admissions to New York City's top specialized high schools. Mm-hmm. But with that being said, as a part of being in this school, I remember that the feeling of walking into these doors at the first day of school, Drew, was a feeling of just complete intimidation, feeling outclassed, feeling like I didn't belong. Because the truth was, in my elementary school, in my middle school, I was in a completely segregated, essentially 100% African-American schools in Brooklyn, New York. And I was cream of the crop, top of the charts. And the way that smartness was performed was a very different way than smartness was performed at the Bronx High School of Science. And the thing that really got me, Drew, was I was in a space now where if I didn't do my homework, nobody was calling my mother. Nobody was raising any red flags. It was almost like, all right, then don't do your homework. And even when I wanted to start making some effort or starting to try, we had a class called technical drawing my sophomore year. And you had to have this whole T-square kit and all these other things. And I didn't buy a kit at the beginning of the year. And I came to class every day and didn't do any of the projects because I didn't have the materials. And I think back to this point, Drew, and I wondered, what would happen if instead of that teacher presuming that here I am, one of these underachieving African-American boys sitting in my class who doesn't feel like doing any work, and instead she actually asked why I didn't have a kit. If she would have asked me why I didn't have a kit, I might have told her that I didn't feel comfortable asking my mother for the money for the kit because her hours had just gotten cut at work. And I didn't want to feel like a burden. And I was trying to get the money going by myself, but it felt like there was always some emergency at the house that needed a bailing out situation. So I couldn't get the money to get the kit. She would have given me a free kit. She would have given me the material. She would have understood what was going on with me. And I certainly wasn't going to be the one vocalizing that to people that were supposed to already have that insight of what was going on with my experience. So a lot of these struggles were the struggles of just struggling in silence and not really feeling those connective relationships with adults that you can really trust, that they're there to support you. It really wasn't until a counselor took a very vested interest in my success that started to become undone in my high school experience. So I think that's kind of the takeaway as well, that when we think about the networks, it's not just about being able to link up with fellow students and job opportunities. It's about this network of I got your back people. We've seen that TED talk about, every child needs a champion. That's not a cliche, man. We really do need a champion. I don't know what I would be in life if Miss Simon, that counselor, didn't pull me aside and say, hey, I looked at your numbers in 8th grade. Like, I look at what you're doing here. You're wasting your potential.
That is, it's really interesting to think about the power of having somebody in your corner like that, and shifting that mindset even a little bit, I think would be pretty powerful. One of the things that I sometimes say that we often say we're only as strong as our weakest link, but in classrooms, I think the dynamic and really in reality in the world in many ways might be better to think like this, which is we're only as strong as our ability to build capacity in our weakest links, right? So how can we help the other people that need the help? And the way that you phrased that kit, she may have given you that kit as a free option, or something like that. But that strikes me as the equity of opportunity, and it's not necessarily the equity of outcome, which is of course a big difference. So providing the opportunities to everybody to get as much potential out of those people and build as much capacity as we can in all of those people.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to phrase it. And I think part of it is a shift of realizing that when I think about what it's going to take to truly provide transformational educational experiences for all kids, again, leveling the playing field so that stories like mine are not accidents, there's a two-pronged thing that needs to happen. One, we need to have that widespread, unshakable belief that all kids can achieve. But the second piece of that is this idea that it is the adults in the building. It is their jobs to ensure that this happens. Like, if you believe that making sure that every kid reaches their full potential is actually your job, it just changes it a little bit. Now your role is like, you're not just a teacher, you're the reacher. You're the motivator in chief. You're the unlocker of potentially buried treasure. And it raises the bar for what it means to be a part of the school experience. And I like to give this story, Drew, of I had a kid once, and he asked me to write a recommendation for him for a summer program. And it was a summer program where they were going to be going off to a college campus. So, Drew, I wrote, this kid was I wrote down, he was amazing. First one in, last one out, always gave his best effort, always the utmost respect, such a hard worker, really so creative, so passionate about his work. And in many ways, Drew, I was lying through my teeth. This kid was a nightmare. He was so tough. He was always giving people so much drama, but I knew he had a spark in him. And I also knew that these are the kinds of experiences that transform kids' lives. To be able to go away for a summer, be on a college campus, I knew what that would do to his ability, his self-belief in what he was capable of. So I had to lie through my teeth to make sure he had access to that experience. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to become liars, but the idea is, are we truly willing to go out on a limb and champion for kids, knowing that those kids need these experiences? Or are we going to continue to do the thing where the student council and all the leadership opportunities only go to all the kids that do all the compliance things the right way?
So one of the things that I had tweeted recently, and what you're talking about strikes me a little bit, brings this point up, is I often say teaching is hard. And as I reflected on that a little bit, I thought, well, that's not exactly right. Teaching itself is not really that hard. It's challenging, right? It's the act of teaching somebody something is not really what I'm talking about. What I really am more referring to is that being a teacher is hard. And how how do we reduce the barriers for teachers to do that kind of great work that you're talking about? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but like, what are the things that we could and should do systemically, maybe, or even at just a building level, like sort of suggestions for leaders, or I don't know, maybe there's things I'm not even thinking about, to really empower teachers to be able to do that great work to empower students. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I'm going to shout out a school that I'm familiar with the leaders. It's called Larchmont Charter School. It's a intentionally diverse school in Los Angeles where they purposefully set it up so that it is meeting the spirit of Brown versus Board of Education. It's racially diverse. It's socioeconomically diverse. And one of the things this school does, which I am surprised there haven't been like 60-minute stories on this, because I thought this was such a radically different idea for what it means to succeed as a school. But they do what's called a whole child inventory. And it started from this experience where they had an activity where they basically put every single kid in the school and they put a picture and their name on a wall, and teachers had to go around the room and write like what they knew about that child. And after everybody walked around and wrote everything out, it was an interesting thing, Drew. The children that had the least amount of information written about them were almost always the kids that were struggling the most academically and behaviorally. And it just changed the impetus. I'm like, okay, we say we're about all kids, but we are literally seeing that we are not about all kids. We do not know what's going on with these students that we're struggling with. And it's our job to know. It's our job. So that just changed the sense of urgency around making sure that you're providing the supports to the kids that actually need them the most. And this whole child check-in to be like, it's not just about grades, it's not just about behaviors, but it's like, do we even know who we are serving? Was a part of making sure that these are not accidental. This became a systematic investment in ensuring that all your kids' needs were met. So again, Larchmont Charter School is doing some fantastic work in this area. And I encourage all schools to try to do something like this, because even if you're not doing it at a whole school level, even if you just did it within the students that you serve in a class, it can be really instructive to understand what you don't understand and what you need to understand about your students.
Yeah, and taking that whole child and even whole teacher approach, I think, is a really important piece. And I tend to think that we're just asking, in so many cases, the wrong questions, right? So it's almost like we are so focused as an education system, and that's, K-12 and even university across the country and in many ways around the world, because the work that we do internationally, we hear a lot of the same kinds of complaints and comments, that the question we're trying to answer is, how do we create content area experts, or kids ready for college, or career ready, or anything like that, and less about how do we create great humans, right? And the assumption that I think some mistakenly make is that if we were to shift towards really creating great humans, that we would lose the opportunity. There would be an opportunity cost for those other things of great learning, of content and career readiness and all of those kinds of things. But that, I don't think, is true. I mean, it might be if you don't do it well, but therein lies the rub, right? We need to do it well, and we need to do education. We need to do it better. And people say, well, education's broke. And I don't think it's broken. It's we're just asking the wrong question. So if we were to focus on creating great humans and doing that well, then we would also create career, college ready, content area expertise, and all of those things that are important now. And I would argue we do it in a way that was contextually deeper and less superficial.
I think you're right, Drew. And I would add that one of the challenges in these sorts of conversations, right, is like, if you talk about shifting the purpose of education towards preparing humans, it could sometimes seem like too radical of a transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that for change to actually work in education, it needs to always be wrapped in a blanket of practicality. And this is where I come in as a computer science graduate who taught math, and I can say it becomes really important that we temper our STEM obsession, because it turns out that a rich education in the humanities actually taps into the essence of what makes us human. And if we are really making sure that the humanities don't remain a priority only in the elite boarding schools, because we've shifted the priority in these other schools to, well, let's get kids ready for these, other options outside of college, or these other high-tech manufacturing jobs that are paying high money now, but are very likely to require different job skills or become more automated as 3D printing and robotics continues to kind of take on popularity. But if we're really focusing on ensuring the essence of the humanities is not thrown to the wayside, that becomes the avenue, Drew, to ensuring that all kids are having this chance to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable, to learn how to truly reason, how to persuade other people. And I can tell you that a lot of the students that I graduated with from Syracuse with my computer science degree, in the past few years, they've seen their wages decline. Some of them have reached a career ceiling. Some of them have gotten laid off, because it turns out there's not a huge market in being socially awkward. The kids that are actually excelling, the students that I went to school with that are doing the best, were in many cases C students. But what do they know how to do, Drew? They can talk tech and they can talk to regular people. They can lead a team. And if you look at what gets managers at Google promoted, it's nothing to do with technical skills. It's all the so-called soft skills that we take for granted and act like aren't all that important. But that is the essence of leadership. That is the essence of what it means to be able to move ahead. We even look at in the political sphere, why are we so enthralled with this idea of who do we want to have a beer with? Why is it that the people that are superintendents of districts aren't usually the most proficient when it comes to they've got all the knowledge when it comes to all things academics? They just kind of get people. They know how to work the systems, how to work the politics, and they get that human aspect of it. But yet the kid that talks to everybody in class gets in trouble all the time. There's value from being a social butterfly. We just need to be able to resonate and understand what that value is and really pour in to the essence of what makes our kids human.
So let's shift gears a little bit here and kind of backtrack in some ways to kind of talking about some of the meritocracy and social justice and equity pieces. I'm just curious from your perspective, and I've asked this of some other guests, but how do you think about, especially from your perspective and work, the I guess white privilege and white supremacy sort of movement? I'm seeing lots of white educators really push the idea and narrative that we need to do things tremendously differently as teachers and systemically as far as resources and things that we teach and how we teach and even and I'm asking lots of questions here, but one of the books that I recently finished, I don't know if you're familiar with it, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, that strikes me as odd in some ways, but I'm curious how you think about those dynamics, especially in regards to teaching and learning.
Wow, that's an easy question. So let me kind of put it like this, Drew. When I think about true equity in education, I think about, again, designing classroom spaces that unleash the potential of every learner. And when I think about what this means practically, because again, anything we do in education must be wrapped in a blanket of practicality. I think about like how we typically do things. When I've gone around the country and asked this question of like, why don't we teach critical thinking to all kids? Why do we still see critical thinking like a luxury good? Like if you're in the gifted and talented classes, you get that. Or if you're in the IB or the AP classes, you get that. Or if you're in the after school mock trial or the robotics club, you get that. And it comes down to this like complete mindset shift of like, okay, what we need to do is we need to ensure that every single child is getting a chance in the classroom spaces to unleash their critical thinking potential. Mm-hmm. And it kind of ties to this conversation around like, all right, like our kids have grit. How do we create classroom spaces to exercise their grittiness? Like, these are the slight changes that need to happen that, to be honest, if we're looking at a profession that is very predominantly white, mm-hmm. and the public school system that is in almost every major urban area, like majority minority, mm-hmm. Then I really don't want to get into the super complex issues of like, how do you create racial justice? How do you do truly anti-racist instruction on a day-to-day basis? All I could do is step back and say, if we are operating under the lens that our job is to unleash the full critical thinking potential of every kid, some things start to change off the bat. Off the bat, you start to see disruptors a little bit differently. You start to see disruptors as potential innovators. You start to understand that, as I understood, kids that are speaking up are doing something that is entirely consistent with what it takes to change the world. And we don't want to get in the way of that. I give a concrete example. I had a student once who was advocating for his peers, saying that I was treating them unfairly because I asked them to change their seat, but I didn't ask these other kids to change their seat. And I'm gonna be honest, it was really annoying. It was really annoying because he was challenging my authority in front of the whole entire class. I stepped him outside for a second and I said, hey, like, you gotta just trust me in what I'm doing. And he was still so mad, so adamant, but we kind of squashed it. But the next day I came to class and I said, look, I want to stop for a second. I want to acknowledge what this student did. This student spoke up for somebody else, and there was nothing good that could potentially come out of it for him. And the truth is, there's rarely a convenient time to speak up against injustice. And the last thing I want to do as your educator, as your teacher, is to prevent you from feeling like you need to speak up when you know that something is wrong, even if there are consequences there. And what that did for the classroom culture, as this kid is now enrolled in a political science program, and he's a sophomore, it's like I've tapped into something that I know is there. It makes sense that he advocates the way he does because his father is a construction worker that's consistently advocating for undocumented people that he works with that are being treated unfairly. Like, this is in our veins. It is in our blood. Let's use this to our advantage. Let's use this to tap into who are our potential leaders. What is the fire in their belly that we can unleash on a day-to-day basis? And that, to me, is how we start to shift the conversation from a more general, abstract notion of social justice to a concrete thing of like developing children who can and actually do change the world.
Yeah, it's interesting so that's a really hard balance, and I think lots of teachers struggle with that. And we've actually had some institutions contact us to try to help work through some of those where professors or teachers, instructors feel really hesitant and are struggling to allow some of those voices, and whether you can call them disruptive or whatever you want to call them, that idea that students are having a voice, and we want students to have a voice, but there's also a dynamic that you sort of recognize there that it can be a problem for the, I guess, learning environment and for moving forward. So how do we empower students to do that in a way that recognizes their voice, but also that there's a responsibility on their part to recognize that they have to have some trust and respect for what we're doing as well, right? So it's not just that, hey, I'm really unhappy about this and this strikes me as unfair or inequitable, but if they don't get what they want, that doesn't mean that they continue to disrupt, although that is tricky because in some cases that continued disruption is necessary, and that's just a really hard balance to make, and there's no question there. It's just sort of, I'm thinking out loud because it is a really difficult piece, and the way that you described it is sort of highlights that difficulty, right?
So Drew, I have a 3-year-old boy, Oliver, a 6-year-old girl, Rose, and I want them to be critical thinkers, but I don't want them to think critically about bedtime. Bedtime is bedtime.
Right.
Dinner is dinner, right? Like, so the thing is though, like, what would you rather have? What would you rather have? Like, because you can't just kind of pick and choose where your kid is going to be a critical thinker, where your kid is going to challenge things. The thing is, when there's that sense of relationship and trust, and they know that everything you're doing is coming from a place of love, and they feel that love not because you're coddling them, but because you're challenging them, because you're opening up spaces for them, it honestly doesn't present as much drama as we might think. Because they know that they know that they're valued, and they understand, like, look, we can't do this right now. Like, we need to kind of push here, be more strategic. We've got a lot of things to cover. Kids can actually respect it, especially when you are honest. And when I say honest, when I say, like, you know, being frank and straightforward with kids, a lot of this comes down to, like, you know, when I was teaching Algebra 2, Drew, and I've got kids graphing polynomials, and they're asking me questions like, when are you going to use this in life? I'm not in the business of lying to kids. I don't walk around graphing polynomials on a day-to-day basis, nor does almost anybody.
Right.
But so I can be real and say, all right, if you take Algebra 2 and pre-calculus and AP calculus, what you're doing is you're sending a signal to these people in colleges that are either taking a limited seat or giving you money that you can do hard stuff and persist through that hard stuff. And it makes it more likely that they'll take you seriously as a candidate because they know that when college gets hard, you'll be more likely to stick to it than people that aren't taking these hard classes. And kids will understand that, and they appreciate when you're being straightforward and upfront with them. And that's a part of what I think the cycle is too. Like, our kids are not idiots. You can be honest with them. You can talk about the game. In fact, if we don't talk to them about the game, they won't even understand that there's a game to be played. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's highlighting again some of those difficulties, kind of backtracking on what I said earlier. It is hard to be a teacher, and some of the dynamics that you mentioned there make it hard, right? So we're playing a game, and in many cases, teachers are being asked to be sort of the game master of a game that they don't really believe in. So therein lies a bit of a rub of, I want to be honest with you and I want to be truthful, but if I do that, I might actually be saying what I'm teaching you isn't really all that necessary for your life. And the way that you said it, you know, certainly does make sense. And unfortunately, that doesn't resonate with some kids. Sometimes they don't have that future forward. They say, well, if I'm not going to use this in life, well, I'm not going to go to college. Or either they might say that, or they may say the opposite, which is the unrealistic expectation that, you know, well, I'm going to get into college regardless because, well, you know, I know everything. I'm 16, so I know everything, right? So that dynamic, that little wrinkle as a teacher makes it really difficult to reconcile, I think, in so far as you're trying to serve at least two different masters. And yeah, you're right. I mean, I have have a 10-year-old who challenges lots of things, and I tell her, I said, she's very much like me. I said, you hopefully, part of my job is to help her understand as early as possible how to harness that and when to pull it back, because bedtime or dinner, I say, take a shower, and she says, I don't want to. And I said, well, I really don't care what you want. This is not an option at this point. You're taking a shower or you're not going to eat dinner, that kind of thing. So it's a difficult choice or balance to make, for sure. So, well, before we leave and wrap up here, tell us a little bit about the workshops that you do and work that you do with schools a little bit more specifically.
Sure. So for our upper grades, we have a whole curriculum that uses real life legal cases. We're typically talking about social studies teachers or homeroom advisory courses, or even summer programs and after school programs where they're seamlessly integrating these real life legal cases into their day-to-day instruction. Cases like a 5-year-old boy that pulled out a chair on his aunt and she falls and breaks her hip and she sues him for battery. And kids are like, that's ridiculous, he's only 5. But now they got to be the aunt's attorney and see it through her lens, step outside of that initial bias and realize, well, I guess he did see her pull out about to sit down, and he pulled it out, and she did fall, but he's only 5. Do 5-year-olds understand the consequences? They're making public policy evaluations of what the world would look like if you just go around pulling out chairs on people. They get seriously hurt, but they couldn't recover because of that person's age. So the idea is we're actually given this thinking like a lawyer model as a sustainable piece of curricular for every single teacher to use, instead of just for the mock trial kids, but for every kid, even for English language learners, really being able to tap in to that sense of fairness and justice. And for lower grades, we do the same thing through fairy tales and nursery rhymes, because there are so many shady characters in children's stories. Whether you're looking at Goldilocks, who has the audacity to break and enter, be all up in somebody's porridge, sleeping all up in their bed, and it gives our kids a sense of perspective and nuance that they wouldn't normally have. When kids are looking at 3 blind mice in the kindergarten, first grade classroom and analyzing the hardships of being a blind mouse, putting themselves in those shoes, coming up with alternative explanations that might explain why they're actually chasing after this vicious farmer's wife person. And what happens to the teacher at that point, Drew, is teachers from the primary grade start to realize there are no barriers for what our kids can accomplish with their critical thinking if you give them that platform. So in that case, like, the curriculum ends up being a way for our teachers to develop muscle memory around what that higher order thinking looks like. But on top of that, we do these thinking like a lawyer workshops to help all teachers in all grade levels use these same exact concepts in their day-to-day instruction. And we also have a course called Pensamiento Crítico, which is critical thinking in Spanish, with the whole idea being around, we've got these English learners that spend all day decoding information, transforming their lives between 2 different worlds, 2 different cultures, 2 different languages. So much critical thinking potential to bring to the table every day. How do we unleash it? And that workshop is all about the practical tools it takes to get them to that point. So those are our main offerings for educators. Yeah.
Okay, and so the website is thinklaw.us, and I know you have some social media links as well.
Sure. Yeah, to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, it's at ThinkLawUS. And if you want to follow me personally on Twitter, it's at Colin E. Seale, and on Instagram, it's at Colin Seale, and that's Seale.
Okay, and we will try to put the links to the schools that you mentioned as well into the show notes for folks who are interested in following up with that. But Colin Seale is his name. He's the founder and CEO of ThinkLaw, thinklaw.us. Thanks so much for the time. It's fascinating to think about this from a I guess an attorney and law perspective. It's something that makes a lot of sense to me, so I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.